In a city that has just been breached, it is not the flames of war that spiral out of control first, but the human heart. Lord Arnolfini, in order to retake his city, promised the mercenaries, as long as the gates are broken, the wealth within the city belongs to them for 24 hours. But the moment the gates were opened, and the blood had barely dried, he reneged on his word. If you were one of these soldiers, selling your life for a noble, only to be used like a dog and then kicked aside, would you swallow this insult? Or would you plunge your blade back into them? The true irony is that what truly unleashed these beasts was not war, but a promise made on a whim and discarded with equal ease by a nobleman. In 16th century Europe, war spread like a plague. Today you are a lord. Tomorrow you might be driven from your castle. Today you are a soldier. Tomorrow you might be nothing more than rotting meat on the roadside that no one bothers to bury. Arnolfini was one who had lost his city in this way. He returned with Captain Hawkwood and a band of mercenaries, Martin among them. This man had no noble surname, no chivalric honor, only a survival instinct as cold and hard as steel. Kill for whoever pays, and strike down anyone who stands in the way. Standing beneath the city walls, Arnolfini promised that if they helped him reclaim the city, the gold, silver, wine, and women of the wealthy were theirs for the taking, for 24 full hours. These words acted like gunpowder, instantly igniting the eyes of every man present. But Arnolfini's son, Stephen, was different. While others sharpened their blades, he studied gunpowder barrels. While others prepared to charge, he pushed a war machine laden with explosives, hoping to use science to blast open the gates. This young man, fresh from university, believed in books, inventions, and the laws of nature. Yet he still did not understand the battlefield, because the battlefield never concerns itself with reason. The gunpowder did not change the war. The soldiers' blades and their lust tore the gates asunder. The city was breached. The mercenaries poured in. Gold and silver were unearthed. Women screamed, and wine barrels were smashed. Martin and his lot, like a pack of starving wolves, finally plunged into the belly of their prey. Yet, just as they believed they would finally collect their reward, Arnolfini began to regret it. He looked at the chaos filling the city, at these men who had bled for him, plundering the wealth he had just reclaimed, and his expression shifted. He no longer called them warriors. He called them scum, rats, and maggots. Hawkwood was dissatisfied, for these were his men, and they had trusted him. But Arnolfini understood power better. A promise is used to ignite others before a battle, and once victory is won, it can be discarded as if it were never made. Thus, the party of victory turned into a trap. Hawkwood led his soldiers to lure Martin and his group into a dead-end alley, sealing the exit with bows and spears. The men who had been reveling a moment ago were suddenly forced to drop their weapons and surrender their spoils. Martin stared at Hawkwood, his eyes devoid of their usual mockery, replaced by cold hatred. It wasn't that he had never seen betrayal, but this time, the betrayal came too fast and was far too filthy. Arnolfini won back his city, but he also sowed the seeds of a much greater disaster for himself. After being driven out, Martin's group wandered in the rain like stray dogs. Celine, who was pregnant, eventually gave birth in the mud to an infant who never drew a breath. The child was buried in the dirt before he ever had the chance to see this wretched world. But while digging the grave, they unearthed a statue of Saint Martin. The chaplain, a man as fanatical as any cardinal, immediately declared it a sign from heaven. The dead child had returned to the earth, and a living saint had risen from it. This meant God had chosen Martin, and that Martin would attain wealth and share it with them all. Is this claim absurd? Of course it is. But when people are in the depths of despair, they are most willing to believe in the absurd, because the absurd at least provides a meaning for their suffering. Martin didn't believe it at first, but he understood people too well. He knew this motley crew didn't need logic, they needed a banner. So he seized the miracle, turning the statue into a command and his revenge into a divine decree. From this moment on, he was no longer just Martin. He had become the man chosen by Saint Martin. Meanwhile, Arnolfini was busy arranging a marriage for his son. Stephen's fiancée, Agnes, was the daughter of Prince Niccolo, arriving with a generous dowry. Arnolfini saw it as a fine transaction, but Stephen only felt a headache. He didn't want a wife. He wanted to be a scientist, to study nature, and to invent new things. That was until he actually met Agnes. Raised in a convent, this girl was bolder than he had imagined. She was no submissive noble lady. She could ride, she could talk back, and she remembered a forbidden legend of the mandrake root from pages the nuns had tried to hide. According to the legend, if a man and a woman share a mandrake root, they will love each other forever. Stephen called it superstition. Agnes countered by asking if a true scientist shouldn't verify everything for himself.
All right.
So, they consumed a piece of the root. It was half joke, half defiance, and half like the hand of fate reaching out. Yes, there was more than half to it, because from this moment on, their story could no longer be calculated by reason. But before their love could bloom, Martin's blade had already arrived. A group disguised as pilgrims approached the carriage train, speaking of God while hiding murder in their hands. The next second, the ambush erupted. The wheels overturned, soldiers screamed, Arnolfini was severely wounded, and Agnes was dragged into the chaos, falling into Martin's hands along with the dowry. Martin had finally reached for what Arnolfini cherished most. He didn't just steal the gold, he stole the fiancée of Arnolfini's son. When she was first captured, Agnes tried to save herself with the instincts of a noble. She claimed her family was wealthy, and that if they let her go, they could have all the gold they wanted. Yet she quickly discovered that, while this group was not lacking in greed, they were entirely lacking in a moral bottom line. They tore her clothes, treating her like a fresh toy, surrounding her amidst the firelight and laughter. Agnes understood. Pleas were useless. Status was useless, and money would only make her more dangerous. So, she made a choice that was both cruel and extremely clever. She stopped merely begging Martin to let her go, and instead made Martin feel that he could possess her. She masked her fear with defiance, reclaimed a sliver of control through compliance, and ultimately framed it as wanting only Martin and no one else. This was not romance. This was a woman thrown to the wolves, using the only method she could conceive to survive the jaws of the pack. Martin saw through her cleverness, yet he did not let her go. He saw something in her that was not just beauty, but something else. The blood of the nobility, the scent of the aristocracy, a world he had never truly possessed in his life. Soon, Saint Martin performed another miracle. The statue moved within the fire, and the crowd knelt in jubilation. The priest said it was a sign that the saint wanted them to continue forward. Some wanted to stay and enjoy the loot, but Martin suppressed all dissent with the miracle. Following the direction pointed by the statue, they arrived at a castle. Agnes knew the layout of the castle, and Martin forced her to lead the way. The group snuck in through chimneys and secret passages, emerging from the darkness like demons. The people in the castle hadn't yet reacted before they were swallowed by blades, fire, and terror. Martin finally had a castle of his own. These mercenaries, who had just crawled out of the mud, began to play the part of nobles. They sat at the long table, gorging on wine and meat, clumsily learning to use forks and knives, donning clean clothes, and declaring that they, too, were now the elite. This is the most ironic part of the play. They hated the nobles for deceiving them, yet once they seized the castle, their first priority was not to create a new order, but to imitate the nobles. They did not want to overthrow power itself. They only hated that they were not the ones sitting in the seats of power. In the castle bath, Agnes continued to draw closer to Martin. She washed away the mud, as if washing away her former identity. She smiled at Martin, talked to him, and even made him believe there was some form of genuine intimacy between them. But was this intimacy love, or a desperate act of survival? No one could say. Martin donned white robes, emerging like a new master. Once, he was a mercenary in the mud. Now, he wanted to be the king of the castle. And Agnes was the brightest and most dangerous jewel in his crown.
Why don't you go say hello to the boy?
Stephen chased him to the outside of the castle and saw Agnes standing on high. She said she was fine, that she was having a wonderful time. Stephen stood stunned, unable to believe that his stolen bride seemed to be standing on the side of the enemy. Martin's men mocked him from the walls, saying Agnes didn't want to go back. Stephen tasted the true humiliation of war for the first time. It is not just losing a person, but having to watch them live on alongside the enemy. And merely living on changes a person. Stephen didn't give up. He found Hawkwood and asked for his help. Hawkwood, infected with the plague, wanted to leave the war behind. But Stephen was no longer the student who only spoke of science. He used his father's authority and the reality of the situation to threaten Hawkwood's men into returning to the saddle. The boy from the books was being ground into an adult by the war. More terrifyingly, he learned very quickly. He built siege weapons and laid siege to the castle, attempting to use his inventions to break Martin's stronghold. But Martin was no fool. He used gunpowder to counterattack Stephen's assault, causing heavy casualties for the outsiders. They captured Stephen, dragging him into the castle to taunt him with every trick in the book. The war became increasingly absurd. A young man who believed in science was forced to learn cruelty. A mercenary who believed in brute force donned the mantle of divine providence. When the frontal assault failed, Stephen used an even more ruthless tactic. Hawkwood's men catapulted plague-infested dogs into the castle.
Don't touch it. It's the plague.
God, it's the plague.
What do we do now?
All we have to do
is burn the meat and our clothes.
The carcasses of the dogs landed in the well, contaminating the water supply for everyone. Agnes discovered it. Stephen saw her. He didn't force her to cry out. He simply left the choice to her: tell Martin or remain silent. This was the most ruthless dilemma in the entire film. On one side was Martin, who had imprisoned and violated her, yet in a way, protected her. On the other was her original fiancé, Stephen. On one side was the chance to live, and on the other was the life of everyone in the castle. Agnes remained silent. The next day, Martin's group ate and drank as usual. One began to suffer from headaches, another from chills. Celine moaned in agony, and Little John said he was tired. It wasn't until they fished that dog out of the well that the blood drained from everyone's faces. The plague. They had drunk death into their bellies. Those who had knelt before St. Martin a moment ago instantly turned their fury toward Martin. Cars cursed him for being led by his own desires, for wearing white robes and hovering around that noble woman, leading them all to hell. Faith collapsed faster than the castle walls. Yesterday, he was the chosen one. Today, he was the sinner who had poisoned them all. They threw Martin into the well, saying they would make him drown in his own poisonous water. Martin struggled, cursed, and fought for life at the bottom of the well, while above, the bandit gang began to disintegrate. Some scrambled for gold to save their lives. Some clung to the sick and refused to leave, and some wept, saying it was divine punishment. In truth, it was no punishment. It was simply the fruit of the seeds they had planted along the way. Martin did not die in the well. He heard Stephen's voice and knew that this young man, also trapped by the chains of circumstance, needed him. He had the key, and Stephen could pull him up, so the two made a deal. Martin promised that if he were saved, he would set Stephen free. But for a man like Martin, the word honor is dirtier than muddy water. Once he escaped, he immediately reneged. Outside, Arnolfini and Hawkwood had returned with their armies. Flames engulfed the sky, lightning struck, and Stephen, using the chains to ground the strike, finally broke free of his shackles. He rushed inside to find Agnes, and Martin found her too. Agnes told him she loved him, yet Martin heard the falseness, the habit, and the desperation in her words. He wanted to believe it, of course, but he understood better that this woman had never belonged to him. She was merely seeking a path to survival beside whoever was winning. The winner takes all. This was the logic Agnes had spoken of before. Now Martin had lost, so he would rather destroy her than watch her return to Stephen's side. He grabbed her by the throat, as if clutching the last bit of his own illusions. Stephen arrived, and the two began to fight. Martin was stronger and fiercer, nearly dragging Stephen into the jaws of death. But this time, Agnes did not continue to stand by. She struck Martin down and fled the burning castle with Stephen. The fire consumed the walls, the plague consumed the bandits, the miracles became a joke, and the wealth became a burden. Stephen and Agnes were finally back in each other's arms, but just then, Agnes saw something. Martin was not dead. He was carrying a bag of spoils, having escaped from the ruins. Agnes did not call out. She simply remained silent. This silence was more cruel than any line of dialogue, because she knew all too well that war would not end with a single victory, and the beasts would not vanish just because of a fire. As long as the world continued to deceive, to plunder, and to treat people as tools, men like Martin would always be able to crawl out from the ruins. The Middle Ages in this film hold no holy light, only corpses in the mud. There are no pure heroes, only people twisted by their environment. Arnolfini used promises to buy war, and then used betrayal to manufacture hatred. Martin thought he was chosen by God, only to be thrown into a poisonous well by his own men. Stephen wanted to use science to change the world, yet he too learned to use the plague to kill. Agnes appeared the most fragile, yet she was the one who survived the wars of men time and again. Therefore, the most terrifying thing is not how cruel Martin is. It is that in this land, everyone can find a reason to allow themselves to become cruel. If it were you, driven to the edge by betrayal, imprisonment, and war, could you still hold on to the person you once were? Or would you too, like them, learn to survive first, and slowly forget why you were living at all?